The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, he'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
The South Kesteven series is sponsored by Gainsborough Cycles 01427 617 752. For all your cycling needs, this is your one-stop shop located at 20 Ropery Road, Gainsborough, or online at gainsboroughcycles.com. There's a link in the description. Gainsborough Cycles, ask for Trevor Halstead. Hello folks, welcome back to South Kesteven once again. If you want to know how ridiculous the British weather is at this time of year, let me put this to you. This run began with Westborough and dry Doddington, which you have already seen, of course. And in that episode I had my hat on because it was still a little bit chilly. Well, it's the same day, would you believe, as I recorded that, and I've just had to go down to my shorts and my t-shirt because now it is completely cooking. It's really, really warm now. But you know what, I've only got this one left to do today, and then I can go and chill out somewhere in a pub or something like that in Grantham. That's where my hotel is. This village is right on the edge of Grantham, and it's got a lot to talk about, including a prisoner of war camp which has now been turned into a caravan park. This is the parish of Allington. Allington, Prince's Farm. Finishing off this South Kesteven run, we have the really interesting little village of Allington, just to the west of Grantham and south of the A1. Now this one will surprise you. It did me because I thought this was just a pretty standard Lincolnshire village with all the usual bits like a church, a school, a village hall and all the rest of it, surrounded by lots of housing. If you look on the map, that's how it appears, but it's what's within the housing that makes this one special. A long time ago, Allington was two separate entities. Even though it's always been one contiguous village, it was split into two parts. These were known as East and West Allington, and they both commanded their own parishes. The boundary between them was weird. It snaked its way right through the centre of the village. Either side of it there was a church. One of them still stands today. That would be Holy Trinity, which served as West Allington's primary religious building. The other one was dedicated to St James, and you won't find that on modern maps. In fact, you'd be hard pushed to know even where it once stood unless you knew of its existence beforehand. In this video I'm going to show you where it was and how to get to it. Perhaps even more interestingly, Allington also has a separate area to the south which used to be a prisoner of war camp. These days we call it Allington Gardens. Those are the two main things this one will focus on, but Allington does still have, of course, all the usual villagey bits we're used to seeing across South Kesteven. So, let's get going and go find them all. We start in the eastern reaches of the village, and our first task is to take a walk along Bottom Street and Main Street to reach the green. It's quite a distance away, so here's a short description of the place we're in today. Allington has a long agricultural history, and for many years farming was the preeminent occupation in the village. At the time of the 1851 census, 75% of villagers worked on the land or as domestic servants. Only 25 people had a trade or a skill other than farming, so it generally was all the place really knew. It used to have two pubs, although now only one remains. That would be the Welby Arms on the green, but its original name was something different. The other was the Plough, which still stands as a dwelling called the White House. Electricity came to the village in 1933, followed by mains water in 1948 and mains drainage in 1952. Since then, things have pretty much stayed the same. Allington hasn't been overrun by massive swathes of new build housing estates, although there is one area that can be described as such. I'll let you know when we're in it. Allington has a notable wartime past. Both Allington Gardens and Welby Hall, landmarks we'll see later in this video, were heavily connected to World War II. Interestingly, during the two World Wars, all 32 Allington residents who served in the armed forces returned home safely. That makes Allington a doubly thankful village, and therefore it has no war memorial. It does though have a manor house, which we're outside right now. The site occupied by Allington Manor was first documented in the Domesday Book. Although nothing remains of that original dwelling, the oldest part of the current building dates back to 1450. In the 16th century, the surrounding land was divided into 3 manors, with the current estate known as West Allington Manor. It was to come into the possession of the Grants, an affluent family of yeoman farmers who were closely linked to the Danbys, prominent locally. It was the Grants who added the iconic Dutch gables and the impressive dog-leg grand staircase to complete the striking Jacobean-style house that stands today. The property remained with the Grants for 2 more generations before the family fell on hard times and the Williamsons took over. It was then passed down through the Williamson family and through marriage the Welby family. Towards the end of their ownership, the structure fell into disrepair and it was uninhabited when it was purchased in 1948 by a Mr. Palin, who saved it from ruin. In 1953, the Vincent family took over ownership and restored this now Grade 2 listed property. The Vincents remain its dedicated owners and residents to this day. Under their stewardship, it became a bed and breakfast, and they welcomed their first guests to it in 2004. By 2006, they expanded to accommodate parties and weddings, and in 2010, the Beauty Lounge was added to its hospitality offerings. It remains an exclusive luxury wedding venue today. Okay, so if you keep going down the road, it eventually runs off into the countryside, but not before it's past the playing field. And there's a lot to talk about with this one, quite frankly. Got a lot for a playing field. We don't usually go into too much detail about them, but we need to here. Just beyond the manor, Bottisford Road begins to round a couple of bends before crossing the border into Leicestershire. On those bends is a sports ground. This was formerly just fields, and this recreation ground is owned by the parish council. It's got a football pitch, a tree-lined dog-walking track around the perimeter, and also something called a trim trail for fun seekers. The playground has a supposedly famous Wickstead Flyer climbing frame. Adding to all of that, there's a multi-use games area, a toilet block, a sports storage pavilion, and a pretty decent car park. The field hosts local community events, including a festival, an annual bonfire, and a fireworks display. At the southeastern end of the field, you'll find the Allington Community Wood. After turning around and heading back to the village centre, the next thing to see is Holy Trinity Church. Now these days, this church is the only one that serves Allington. That's not always been the case. There were once 2 churches in this village, and they were pretty close to each other. Holy Trinity has served the whole of Allington since the other one was pulled down. Some of the materials from the other church have been used to repair this one. Holy Trinity can be traced back to the 12th century thanks to the presence of its Norman arches and pillars on the northern side of its nave. By the end of the 14th century, it gained a double bell coat with the original bells, and they're still rung at every service. In the 15th century, the west wing of the church was renovated in the Perpendicular style, and in the 17th century, a repair was carried out to the nave. Perhaps indicative of the general building materials used back then, red brick was chosen to effect the repair, which is why it looks out of place with the rest somewhat. The vicar at the time, a certain Reverend Robert Clark, paid for the work at his own expense. The Jacobean pulpit and gallery were installed by the same rector who also rebuilt the rectory. Sometime between 1914 and 1917, the chancel arch was widened, the north window was blocked off, and a vestry was added. In more recent times, a stained glass window was made by the renowned Tony Holloway, who spent many years working on the windows of Manchester Cathedral. Now, I was hoping in this churchyard I'd be able to get a look at Allington Hall, which is behind Holy Trinity. Unfortunately, though, I can't see it. There's loads of trees and bushes and all sorts of foliage in the way. So, yeah, we're going to have to do this with pictures, if I can find some. Assuming that I have, here's a bit about Allington Hall. Next to the church is Allington Hall, a small country house which is originally 17th century in date. It was heavily altered in 1727, 1875 and in the 20th century. Essentially, it's a hodgepodge of bits from the late 17th century onwards. Thomas Williamson, the rector of Westborough and Dry Doddington nearby, purchased the hall along with the manor house and their lands in 1674. The back of the hall is probably 17th century, but the grander south front was obviously built upon by the Williamsons, and it became the principal house of their estate. The top storey was added in the early 19th century, and it no doubt increased the accommodation required by a Victorian household, but at the same time it took away the charm of the earlier front. The grand east front, which was built in 1727, has since been demolished. Now we're on the green. This is usually where things like war memorials are sited, but as we know already, Allington doesn't need one of them. It does have a Grade 2 listed cross though. Principally limestone, it's medieval in origin and was rebuilt in the later 19th century. The monument includes the foundation, its base, a socket stone, a shaft, a knop and a head. So why does Allington have a cross then? Well, believe it or not, this tiny village once had a market. What's perhaps even slightly less believable is the fact that said market was second only to Grantham in terms of local size and importance at one time. It's no wonder then that a few years ago there was a campaign to restore this historic structure. As early as 1746, records indicate there was a shop in the village because they mention a shopkeeper. Until recently, Allington still had a shop and a post office. It was located within this building here, but now it's a private residence. Today though, Allington's nearest facilities are in Grantham, unless you count the services on the A1 at Foston. This is the Welby Arms, which takes its name from the family of the same name. It used to be alternatively known as the Spread Eagle before its name was changed. As we know already, the Welby family owned land here in the 18th century. It was later sold and their estate was dispersed in 1947. By the 18th century, the Williamsons owned most of the land instead, but the Welby Arms still bears the family name. It's 19th century in origin and remains to this day a popular country pub providing good food, a well-managed bar and overnight accommodation. Allington used to have a second pub called the POW, which is now known as the White House. Thankfully, there's no American presidents living in Allington, current or former. I have to say this shelter feels fairly familiar, because in the days when I used to do the parish notice board, we did one here in this very shelter in Allington when we were coming back from somewhere down south. I don't remember exactly where. So yeah, it feels kind of weird to be sort of back in the same place again. Speaking of parish notice boards, there's one right next to this shelter. So if you'll come with me, we'll put one on this board right here. There it is. We'll walk out of the shelter, past the Welby Arms, and there we have it. It's now officially in the books. Thank you very much, Allington. There we go. Now, from here, the next landmark is one that you might not even know exists. You won't find it on modern maps. You might find it on an old map or two, but certainly on nothing modern. To get to it, you have to walk between these two houses here, down this little path, and it'll take you to the site of St James's Church. Behind the pub, up a small grass track leading from the green, is Allington's biggest secret. You would be hard pushed, if you didn't know where it was beforehand, to know where St James's Church stood before it was pulled down. The answer is up this track on a patch of land that sits between Bottom Street, Side Street and Main Street. It seems strange that a tiny place like Allington could have two parish churches, but in the past the present village spanned the boundary between the two parishes of East and West Allington, and both had a church. West Allington was a parish in its own right under the patronage of the Lord Chancellor, but East Allington Parish was a chapelry of Sedgebrook. The parish boundary meandered through the village. Most of the village today is in what was East Allington, whilst the Hall, Holy Trinity, Allington Manor and houses further along Bottisford Road were in West Allington. Even the Domesday Book records there being two churches in Allington, one belonging to Robert of Tadini and the other to Berenger of Tadini, who was probably Robert's son. Robert's church was almost certainly where Holy Trinity is. It's not known exactly where Berenger's church was, but by the mid-13th century there was a small chapel here on the site of St James's. As East Allington was a chapelry, St James's was referred to as a chapel of ease. St James's was a small, plain stone building with early English and perpendicular features, consisting of a chancel, a nave, a south porch and a bellcote with two bells. There was seating for 70. Records show that the building was restored in 1855 and much of the costs were paid by John Earl Welby. In 1896, East Allington was separated from Sedgebrook and thus both Allingtons became one. By the 1940s, St James's had fallen into disrepair as there hadn't been any regular services for many years. Charles Pelham Welby wrote to the church authorities saying it was an eyesore, and seeing as Holy Trinity needed a repair, St James's was pulled down in 1951. Holy Trinity then took priority because it was bigger and closer to the hall. Its bells still exist though. They were taken to Sedgebrook for storage and the font ended up at St Michael's Church in Waddington. So you'll remember earlier I mentioned there's an area of new builds and I'll tell you when we're in it. Well, here we are, we're in it. These aren't massively new, they weren't built within the last 5 years or anything like that. Mind you, they are still new to Allington and what makes them interesting is where they stand. Before these existed, this was part of Allington Hall's parkland. That's why the two streets that make up this estate are called Park Road and Park Avenue. Where Park Road fronts Foston Road, there used to be a gate lodge and the hall's kennels, because there was an entrance drive leading to the hall itself. Although the track is now lost under these new houses, both the lodge and the former kennel buildings still stand on the Foston Road. Okay, we're almost all the way around Allington now. There are just 2 landmarks remaining. One of them is the village hall and the other one is the school. To wrap up the walk, we have 2 more landmarks before we can call it a day and hop in the car. On Side Street we have the village hall. Popular and centrally located, this is built of red brick and it was presented to the village in 1929. It's licensed for 120 people seated and 200 standing. The main hall is 42 feet long and 24 feet wide, and the building also has an annex. The kitchen is modern and well equipped, and the hall has a range of good access facilities, including an entrance ramp and patio doors. In addition to being available for community hire, the hall also acts as Allington's hub for outreach services, such as the post office. Via Side Street and Gonaby Lane, we find ourselves on Marston Road finally, where we have the school. This hasn't always been sited here, by the way. Believe it or not, Allington's first school was actually on the village green. It was built in 1847 but moved to its current location in 1906. Since that time it's undergone some significant expansions, and in 1983 perhaps the most notable of those took place. It was in that year that the school became sufficiently large enough to cope with children not just from Allington but also from Sedgebrook. That's why the name of this place isn't just Allington Primary, instead it's Allington with Sedgebrook Church of England Primary. The school has had some excellent Ofsted reports down the years, and children from many nearby villages attend it today. With this visited, we're literally yards away from the starting point, but there's one last little bit to cover, and for it, we need the car. And there you go, there's the walk around Allington Village. Now, before we leave this one behind, we have one more thing we need to cover, and we're going to use the car for this. To the south of Allington, there's a big area of caravans, and that used to be something very different in wartime. Let's find out what. Allington Gardens is located on the edge of the main village to the south. It looks, on the map at least, to be a separate village, but it's really not. In fact, it even has some rights of way that link it to the rest of Allington, so getting between the two on foot is relatively easy. Today, the site it occupies is full of park homes. It's owned by Berkeley Parks, and in the last few years, Allington Gardens has seen the number of homes here grow to more than 200. It's been this way for a while. Before being the park home site it is now, it was previously a residential caravan site. Some residents refer to this as Allington Camp, and that's not totally inaccurate as far as names go. During World War II, that's exactly what it was. Up to the beginning of the war, Allington Gardens was agricultural land which was requisitioned from Charles Pelham Welby to be used as a prisoner of war camp. It was a suitable site for one because it was close to a pipe that transported water to Bottisford Aerodrome. It became known as POW Camp 51 and opened in late 1942 as a Labour battalion for about 500 Italians. Numbers rose though, and by 1943 records show there were some 750 Italian prisoners here. By 1945 the Italians had been replaced by Germans, who were later joined by Ukrainians. Allington was classed as a standard camp and prisoners were sent out to work. 4 bungalows were built on Sedgebrook Road to provide accommodation for the drivers who took them to work on the farms throughout the neighbourhood. Those bungalows have now been replaced by new ones. Both Catholic and Protestant services were held in the camp, and at one point it had a 14-piece orchestra. In 1948, the Germans had been repatriated or were in transit, but 1,400 Ukrainian prisoners were still resident here and would become part of the European Voluntary Workers Scheme. This meant Allington could no longer be called a camp, and it was relisted as a hostel for the EVW. Eventually, they too were repatriated, and the site was divided into two sections. Part was used as a pig farm, and the rest for static caravans, sited on the foundations of the old camp buildings. At one time there was a cattery, which some villagers remember using, and there was a social club too. The static caravans were eventually replaced with park homes on new foundations, firstly by Avondale and then by Berkeley Parks, who are still working to fill in the gaps now, all while staying within the borders of the former prisoner of war campsite. Mark off Allington, everybody. That's another South Kesteven one complete, and we're now up to 20 of them in the bag all told. There'll be more very soon, but for now that's your lot. Keep your eyes glued to North Kesteven though, because that's where my main focus in Lincolnshire will be now for a while. Until we meet again down here, folks, it's bye for now. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.